Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Virgin Stars Podcast third season. For my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. This is an amazing episode because Ron Marz returns to the mothership to discuss Zero Hour 30th anniversary special from DC Comics. Now, come aboard as we go traversing the stars.
Hello, Mr. Marz. Thank you for coming to Versus Stars podcast. Huge fan of yours. I'm going to nerd out just a little bit. And like I said, I've been loving your work since all the days of Kyle Rayner and Silver Surfer and all those characters. I want to thank you so much.
Happy to be here, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Thank you. And apparently, if I stumble over my words, at least we know why. Anyways, so as we talk, Kyle Rayner is celebrating his 30th anniversary as a DC character. At first I said 40th year, but I don't want to age this apparently too quickly, but apparently it's 30th year. So what do you think has been the key to the character's longevity? Because a lot of characters, even replacement characters, a lot of them don't last.
I wish I could tell you that I had a definitive answer and there's a magic formula to do this, but I don't know. I wrote a character that I was interested in reading about and tried to make him a character that was relatable to the audience and that the audience could see themselves in. Very much on the Peter Parker everyman sort of model of character, which DC didn't really have at the time. So if I have to attribute it to anything, I think it's probably that readers could kind of see themselves in his shoes. Whereas, Batman, Superman, Hal Jordan, uh, you weren't really going to grow up to be them. They were specific and unique and very aspirational in terms of who they were. And which is also an absolutely worthy, character trope. But we were more nerdy kid gets bitten by a radioactive spider than we were last son of Krypton who can do anything.
Hmm. And I think the interesting about Kyle Rayner, like I said, created in 1994, he is the Green Lantern for an entire generation of Green Lantern fans. He is how we understand Green Lantern. He is how we believe the universe as being the lone Green Lantern and everything else is supposed to go. How does it feel to be the writer and the creator of basically a generation's version of Green Lantern?
It's obviously flattering. I think I'm very appreciative that people are still attached to the character and still want to see what we're going to do with him. Um, I think like most things, the thing that you discover at just the right age, which I think for most people is 10, 11, 12 years old. Particularly 12 years old, I think is sort of when we start to become our own people and discover things on our own. The things that we discover at that age are still the things that mean a lot to us 30 years later. I know that the stuff that I truly love is mostly stuff that I discovered at that age. So I think it's a fairly common I think it's a fairly common thing for us to be attached to the thing that we found and was ours. It was our thing when we started to be our own people, not just sort of little versions of our parents.
Now, I will say I'm a longtime Green Lantern fan. So I actually started buying Green Lantern around issue 17 of the second volume, approximately. And I've, for the most part, kept collecting through that era, through Emerald Twilight, going into your Kyle Rayner. But I will say, once you experience Kyle Rayner, he easily eclipsed Jordan. I think the issue with Jordan was that he did feel, especially back then, a little too righteous, maybe a little bit more bitchy than you should. But you know what I'm saying? But it's definitely more two-dimensional than what Kyle Rayner turned out to be. Kyle Rayner felt like he allowed you to experience Green Lantern, being the Green Lantern experience than Hal Jordan because you were watching it with him. And I think because I was reading comic books for a couple of years before Kyle Rayner came, at least for Green Lantern before he came out, I enjoyed watching him discover what I already knew. So it's like a reader kind of like, oh, he's gonna learn about this, he's gonna experience this, and I think that just added this little extra like realism and enjoyment and experience that Jordan you already kind of felt like, well, he's already done everything. Now you're kind of just watching him do more.
Right. He's been there and done that. I think that's just a general, that's a general story thing. I think stories of discovery and stories of the hero becoming the hero are very much stuff that attracts people. We go on Luke Skywalker's journey with him as he becomes a hero from naive farm boy to Jedi. That's one of the main reasons we pay attention to that story. So I think someone becoming a hero is generally a more interesting story than someone being a hero. And certainly in Hal's case, he had been the hero and had been doing the job for decades. And to a great extent, he was already a hero when we meet him, right?
Yeah.
Hal's a test pilot. He's very much cut from 1960s right stuff, space race kind of era, which I think is, it works especially well in that era. I think that's, to me, that's a prime reason that um, Darwin Cook's work with Hal is kind of my favorite version of Hal because it's set in the 60s.
Mhm.
It's an era specific story. And I think Hal works great as, Chuck Yeager with a power ring. Um, but we got to start over. We got to, go through that hero's journey and the sense of discovery of everything that went with the Green Lantern legacy and everything in the DC universe through the eyes of somebody who was sort of wide-eyed in wonder at all this stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that's always an attractive story to tell because even if you're well versed in all of that stuff, if you're familiar with all of that, seeing it through the eyes of a character who is discovering it is a journey that you generally want to go on as a reader.
And once again, and I'll say for myself, I bragged a few times on the show that I have every Green Lantern comic book ever written since 1960, including miniseries, spin-offs, and everything else. I have all of them. So I mean, obviously, I love Hal Jordan, but I will say, up to the point of reading from 17 to the point of Emerald Twilight, it felt like the most interesting thing Hal Jordan ever did was go crazy. You know, he was saying go and become Parallax.
Yeah, and well, I think that in a lot of ways that goes back to the sense of there are no bad characters, but there are bad stories,
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that DC decided to make a change with Green Lantern is that the portrayal of Hal had become kind of stale.
Mm.
And he had the Reed Richards temples going on, and he very much seemed like a hero from another era rather than somebody that was more contemporary. So I do think certain runs on certain characters, um, they tend not to work sometimes. Marvel, DC, anything. So it's always waves and troughs. There's an ebb and flow to it, and if you've got a run or a few runs in a row that don't work, you need to do something. Uh, in our case, something rather severe to get the
Mm.
attention of the audience back.
And as you know, I really loved what Jeff Johns did later on, bringing Jordan back in the expansion. Do you think something was lost in having Jordan have the excuse that he was possessed by Parallax instead of a moral flaw?
Well, it's just, it's a different story than mine, certainly. And I'm friends with Jeff and I don't begrudge him the story that he told. That's just part of working in a shared universe.
Mm.
Every story that comes after yours stands on the shoulders of your story, and your story stands on the shoulders of what has come before. Um, and I've said this before that if you don't like if you don't like that aspect of working in a shared universe, that somebody can undo your story or have a different take on a story that you did. If you're not comfortable with that, you shouldn't be doing big two superhero books because that's the nature of it. You have
Mm.
to be okay with coming in and doing what you get to do, and then you put the toys back on the shelf, and somebody else comes in and does what they want to do.
Now, with Green Lanterns, when Rayner was first created by you, he became the lone Green Lantern. Jordan, because he had gone become a villain, is kind of was out of the picture. Stewart and Gardner really wasn't part of the picture at that point. They kind of Gardner was doing Guy Gardner Warrior at that point. Stewart can't remember how they kind of wrote him out a little bit, but he wasn't doing anything. And now there's like 7 or 8 Green Lanterns. Do you think Reiner gets lost a little bit in the number of Green Lanterns that are now on Earth?
Well, yeah, I think that's bound to happen. Particularly, any character that doesn't have his or her own book in which they're a lead character, they get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Um, but that also goes in waves and troughs. You have a main character and the characters that orbit around him, no pun intended. Um, you know, don't get as many pages, don't get a storyline of their own very often. But you know, superhero comics are kind of like the weather. If you don't like what's going on right now, come back in a little while and it'll probably be
Hmm.
different. So, I'm pleased that Kyle is still around and that he's still got a place in the DCU. And when I or anybody else gets to go in and play with him, it's always pretty satisfying.
And not only in the 30th year of Kyle Rayner, but we're now in the 30th year of Zero Hour, which was one of the big event books from the 90s. And in many ways, you think about history of DC comic books since Great Christmas Infinite Earths. It's I think one of the bigger events that they had done at that point. Your tie-in issue, I think, was what, 5 issues into your run of Kyle Rayner, maybe 4 issues.
Yeah, something like that. It's 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there between 55 and 56, maybe. I don't
Hmm.
know. But certainly within the first year, yeah.
Did you when you were plotting out your first years of Kyle Rayner, did you know that 0 issue tie-in was going to come in?
No, I had no idea. I didn't know Zero Hour was a thing. And my editor actually forgot to tell me that it was a thing. Um, I had, eventually I came to understand that, oh, Dan was doing this thing called Zero Hour. And then at some point thereafter, I found out that Parallax, in the Hal guys, was the villain of Zero Hour, and I was like, well, where the hell did that come from? So my editor was under the impression that he had told me that was going on. He had not. So when it came time you know, to write the Zero Hour script for my tie-in issue, I was like, okay, well, what are we doing? And that's when I found out that Hal was the big adversary in the storyline. So I had to learn really quickly, like all of what was going on in Zero Hour, and then put all of that into our issue, which turned out to be fairly integral to the whole thing. Turned out great, and I'm really happy with the issue. But we sort of got a late start on it because sometimes things slip through the cracks.
Now, my memory of the Zero, I know it was obviously Green Lantern Zero, which was the title. Did also Green Lantern, like I said, I think it's 54, 55, somewhere in that one, which is the in continuity, in ongoing numbering tie-in. And that one, I believe you had Alan Scott show up. How cool is that to have him and Kyle Rayner? And how did that kind of idea come about?
Oh, it was, I wanted, since we were doing a, quote unquote legacy character, I wanted to make sure that we brought in other versions of that legacy. And I had actually written Alan Scott before in some Green Lantern Quarterly stories, which was my first DC work. I did, a handful of stories for Green Lantern Quarterly, including Alan Scott. And that was sort of my introduction to working at DC, and in some ways that was part of what led them to offering me the regular Green Lantern book, as well as what I was doing on Surfer over at Marvel at the time. So it was, Alan was not unfamiliar to me at the time, but like bringing him into the regular monthly book felt like we were finally becoming part of this larger Green Lantern legacy that was out there. And I knew I wanted to lean into that. I wanted to have Guy in the book and John Stewart, and obviously bring Hal back at some point as Parallax. But it was always a balancing act of, all right, well, we have to do new things, and we want to make sure that we're devoting enough time to establishing Kyle and his supporting cast and everything around him, as well as pulling at some of those plot threads from the legacy, from what the franchise had been before, which was obviously to a great extent, outer space opera. Um, and we had turned it in because we were doing a solo character. We had turned it into much more of an Earth-based book for at least for a time.
Hmm. And I think it was Parallax. I think proved to be such an interesting antagonist for Kyle Rayner. Parallax View was a wonderful storyline, and then he returns around issue 100 as well with the storyline. Did you miss not having Jordan as a potential major antagonist for Kyle Rayner every so often?
Well, I mean, once the decision was made to, turn Hal into the Spectre, and then, we had he went through a number of iterations, obviously, before coming back as Green Lantern. Um, I always liked Hal as Parallax because I thought it gave the DCU another cosmic level antagonist. I wouldn't even say villain because I never really viewed Hal as a villain. In the Parallax role, I always viewed him as more of an antagonist because his goals were different than those of the rest of the heroes. Didn't necessarily mean he was wrong, and it didn't necessarily mean that it was bad if the audience commiserated with him. I sort of wanted him to. I wanted part of the audience to be like, well, he's kind of got a point, because I think that humanizes your villains. I think that I very much thought of him in the same respect as Magneto in the X-Men, who to great extent is not wrong. He's just a lot more extreme than Professor Xavier. But I think a chunk of the X-Men readership looks at what Magneto's doing and goes, well, he's not exactly wrong. So that was some of what was in my mind when we were having Hal in the book, is I never wanted him to be like, a mustache twirling villain. I wanted him to be more of a tragic figure
Hmm.
and one who was worthy of the audience's empathy.
Now, going about Parallax as the villain, we're gonna jump a little bit into what you're working on now, which is Zero Hour 30th Anniversary, which was you co-wrote with Dan Jurgens, who Dan Jurgens, for those who don't know, I'm sure they do, wrote the original Zero Hour miniseries. So can you kind of go, how did this issue come about, and what was the co-writing duties like?
Well, Dan and I have been friends for, I don't know, 25 years, at least, probably a little more. And we just, so we're in touch anyway. If we see each other at a show, we're always headed out to dinner. And frankly, Dan is the commissioner in my fantasy football league. So I have to deal with him on a weekly basis. So we just got, I don't know, we were on a call one time just catching up, and we started kicking around the idea that, oh, by the way, it's 30th anniversary for Zero Hour and Emerald Twilight in the same year. Which Dan was more aware of than I was, because he had just done 30th anniversary specials for Death of Superman and Return of Superman, which generated a lot of interest and sold a lot of comics, and we're very successful. So we started to kick around the idea of, well, maybe an Emerald Twilight and or Zero Hour special would make sense, coming on the heels of those two specials. So we pitched it to DC, and we pitched it as either, an Emerald Twilight special and a Zero Hour special that would, dovetail one to the other, or just an overall, special that sort of pulled in all of those elements. And DC decided to do one 80 pager rather than two smaller specials. And as soon as DC decided, okay, yeah, this is good, we want to do it, it's greenlit, we had to hit the ground running, because we didn't have that long to actually get the thing done, because they had put it on the schedule for August, thankfully last week of August, which means we didn't have a lot of time. We had 80 pages to fill, and we also had, just before this thing was supposed to go to press, was San Diego, which obviously blows a huge hole in everybody's schedule. So we had to figure out how to do this thing in a fairly short amount of time. and then recruit a bunch of artists to come in and fill chapters for us. And thankfully, everybody that drew a chapter in this special, which was Darryl Banks, who was my Green Lantern compatriot, Kelly Jones of Batman fame, Tom Grummett, who worked on the Superman books in the 90s, Jerry Ordway of being Jerry Ordway fame, who also obviously worked on Zero Hour. Paul Pelletier, who was also with me on Green Lantern for years. Howard Porter, whose resume is led by JLA with Grant Morrison, and then some guy named Jurgens who drew the last chapter. So we got our pick of the litter in terms of artists to work with, and thankfully, everybody has been down this road before. Everybody on that list has been in a tight deadline situation, and certainly been in a situation where you're referencing other artists' pages. The amount of coordination that was required to get this thing done and get it right was fairly significant. Huge props to our editor, Brittany Holzer, and her assistant, Chris Rosa, for pulling this whole thing together, and letting us do our jobs when we needed to, and sort of looking over our shoulder when we needed that as well. So it was a big undertaking, and I think I speak for Dan when I say we're both really happy with the way that it turned out, because we're working with a bunch of guys who are our buddies, and I think that makes the process a little bit easier. So we got it done, got it off to press, and now looking at it, with all of those artists and with Norm Rapman doing some inks on it over Tom Grummett and Paul Pelletier, and Alex Sinclair coloring the entire book and pulling the whole thing together. We really feel like we hit the bullseye with it, because when you do a project like this with a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of ways for it to go wrong, and I think we avoided them for the most part.
Like I said, I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, obviously, I may not be a hard sell. It starred Kyle Rayner, and so it was like inherently I knew I would like it regardless. But I thought it was really well done. How early in the process did you know Kyle Rayner was the star?
From day one. I mean, we knew that it was going to be a Kyle story, both because it made sense, narratively it made sense, and also because part of the concept was it was an Emerald Twilight 30th anniversary as well, so he was naturally going to be the star, and Hal Jordan as Parallax was naturally going to be the antagonist, and then we had to figure out, okay, well, how do we tell a story that's contemporary, that is set now, because it's not set 30 years ago, it's not set during the 90s. It starts now and it ends now, and it goes into what we ended up calling the Splinter universe, which was a version of Hal Jordan as Parallax, preserving a universe in which Superman did not come back from death, and which Batman's gets his back broken, but it does not heal. So we ended up having to populate a universe that is like the DC universe of the time, but not quite. And it was actually a ball. We got to do a lot of, we basically, the new Trinity in the Zero Hour anniversary special is Supergirl, Donna Troy as Wonder Woman, and Batgirl. So it's the universe you're familiar with, but it's not quite the universe you're familiar with. So we got to bring in a lot of characters that had their heyday in the 90s, like Starman, and just sort of have fun for 80 pages.
Yeah, I was gonna say you brought back some of my favorite characters from the '90s, and still those characters I love. Azrael was a great callback. I just mentioned Starman, Obsidian. You brought back so many really cool characters. Were there any characters that you were told you can't bring back?
No, we got to do kind of whatever we wanted. There was, there was not a pushback on anything that we wanted to do really, except for, okay, how do we balance the Parallax Fear Entity version and the Parallax Hal Jordan version. So there was some discussion over, all right, how do we pull all that together? And without giving away any spoilers, I think we did that at the end of the book and left an open door for um, picking up the threads from this story at some point down the road.
So when you're working with there's you and the Dan Jurgens, once again, two great writers, all in one project. Did you guys split script work? Did one do mostly the scripting, and one handle most of the story concept, or was it a complete collaboration?
Dan and I kicked around the ideas for it. Dan sort of came up with the framework of, okay, how about this for chapter one and this for chapter two, and we went back and forth on that, and I kibitzed and added some things, and it the coming up with the story was a very collaborative process. And then I scripted the first 50 pages. I broke down and scripted the first 50. Dan did the last 25. Um, and it just worked out that way because since Dan was drawing the last chapter as well, we needed to get him freed up so that he could start drawing rather than plotting more of the story. Um, so I plotted and scripted the first 50, Dan did the rest, and took on the added task of drawing the cover, drawing the last 15 pages. And it all just sort of, honestly, it all just kind of fell into place. And we had a bunch of fun, putting all the puzzle pieces together. And then you do that, you take a step back and you make sure, okay, did all of the I's get dotted and the T's got crossed, and we, every with all of the people that were involved, did we did we tie up everything the way we wanted to? And I think we did. I mean, there was, in the last week before it went to press, there were some, tweaks in dialogue and a bunch of coloring changes so that we were making sure that everything was consistent. But that's the nature of putting together a book this size. Like I said, I think we're both really happy with it.
I think you guys did, like I said, did a wonderful job with the book. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. I think one thing that was kind of interesting is how you wrote Kyle Rayner. Because Kyle Rayner had been through a lot of stuff from your end of your run to the beginning of Zero Hour, the anniversary. A lot of he'd been through a lot of shit. Let's just put it that way. But I do kind of feel like the Rayner we saw in the Zero Hour anniversary was more of the traditional Kyle. Was there a decision to kind of maybe ignore or push aside some of the crappier version, the things they did with some of the character stuff?
Well, not really. I mean, it was just me writing my version of Kyle, and trying to reconnect with some of how that was done in the '90s during our initial run, and also not wanting to confuse the issue with, you don't want these things to read like a continuity handbook, and go into, well, Kyle was Ion, and then he was a White Lantern, and like all of that stuff doesn't really matter for the story. The core of who Kyle is and where he is right now was what really mattered for our story. So I explained enough of what was necessary, I think, to gather up, or to get readers up to speed as to where Kyle was now. But I didn't go into a treatise of, here's everything that's happened to him. And frankly, I wrote the entirety of my Green Lantern run with a first person narration from Kyle's point of view, because I wanted the reader to be inside his head. I wanted the reader to identify with him as their POV character. And so I did that again in the Zero Hour special, because it seemed fitting, and it also gave us a device to communicate stuff to the reader that maybe wasn't going to be communicated in dialogue, but needed to be in there. So having that first person narration is really sort of it's a writer's trick for being able to deliver aspects of the story that aren't going to be discussed by characters, and also deliver some character stuff that hopefully people react to. I think ultimately, yes, the big fight scenes and all of the the expansive visuals, that's why we read comics. But I think we come back to comics because we care about these characters and because we want to see what happens to them. So the more we can personalize this and get inside characters' heads, I think the more attractive it is for the audience.
Now, Kyle Rayner has to make a big decision. Not giving away too many spoilers, but the decision he makes is kind of catastrophic in some level from a certain perspective of individual. We're not going to go into too much detail. Um, do we? Is that going to have long-term effects on Kyle because he does have to make a decision that, in some way, is costly, depending on your kind of perspective on how it all played out.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so. It's a again, as you said, without getting into too many spoilers, it's a large and necessary decision, and a serious decision, and it's frankly one that Dan and I kicked around quite a bit in discussing. All right, how are we gonna tell this story, and how are we gonna end this story? How are we gonna get some sense of conclusion to the story, if not a sense of completion. Um, and so we went back and forth on how this was all going to be resolved, and I think we settled on the right answer, even though it's a difficult choice.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the nature of drama, period. It's characters making decisions and then dealing with the ramifications of those decisions. So so I think Kyle makes the only choice he can, but in some ways that choice is also forced upon him by the people that are around him.
Hmm.
And we certainly we wanted to make you feel the emotion of that. We wanted to, one of my main objectives in this whole story was I wanted the Kyle Rayner Donna Troy relationship to be kind of front and center in this story and to have some emotional resonance and kind of wrestle with is this the person I'm supposed to be with?
Hmm.
And the universe has, or in this case universes, have split us apart, and do I put do I put my own feelings and desires over those of the greater good? Do I find a way to be with her? Do I find a way to save her at the expense of the world? So, I mean, to me, that was a big part of what attracted me to what we were doing. Is I wanted to have those two characters back together and force the reader to think about all that stuff as well.
Now, as we talk about Parallax and his decision making, I'm talking about creating a character sort of like Magneto that, on a certain perspective, he's not wrong. I mean, may not Parallax or Hal Jordan Parallax may not have made the psychologically best decision when he did what he did, but once he did go forward with it, was he wrong in wanting to sustain it? Do you think?
Oh yeah, well, I think in a lot of ways he wasn't wrong. And I think that's something that we put in front of the reader and sort of leave you to figure it out, leave you to come, and hopefully not everybody that reads the story and wrestles with Hal's decisions and Kyle's decisions. Hopefully, not everybody comes up with the same answer. I think that kind of boring if everybody has the same answer. To me, stories are much more interesting if um, if different members of the audience have different takes and different reactions to what's in front of them. So yeah, we didn't want the whole thing to be black and white. We wanted it to be kind of shades of gray, and there's no 100% right answer in any of this stuff. Um, it's 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 what we as humans do, right? We try to make the best decision under the circumstances, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't.
I mean, and when you think about Jordan, I mean, he made a decision on some level is extremely selfish, but he does without giving too much away. What he does is kind of helpful to the people there on some level. Um, is that I mean, is his decision then or his place in it purely selfish or in like a form of narcissism that he did it, or would you argue there's some sort of benevolent intention and you know?
I honestly think it's both, and we try to portray it as both. Again, you don't want the decisions to be black and white, and you certainly don't want your characters to be black and white. Um, Hopefully, the audience comes away from the special feeling like, that there wasn't maybe a good answer.
Hmm.
It's just the best answer you can come up with at the time. So, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, what Hal was doing was, yes, selfish. But also once he started doing it, it's not just for him anymore. It's for this splinter universe that he's created and trying to keep that whole and keep that intact. Um, so it's yeah, there are a lot of tough choices involved in the story, and I hope that people, I hope that the story stays with people after they get to the last page,
Hmm.
feeling like, well, what was the best thing here? Um, it's very easy when your villain's 100% an absolute evil villain and your hero is, a knight in shining armor. It gets a lot more complicated, uh, much like real life, when it's not that, when everybody sort of has shades of gray, and there is no clear-cut perfect choice.
And I agree. I did say when I finished reading the book, that was my first stop. I stopped. I was like, huh. Well, Kyle Rayner's not going to sleep well for a few nights, I'm sure, after how this all plays out. And I said I think it was great. It was complex for both Jordan and Rayner. One thing that I thought was really kind of interesting, the last page. Without giving anything away, it definitely is a to be continued type page. Was there already a plan in place for what's going on here to continue?
There's nothing official that I can report, or that I'm allowed to say, but certainly, uh, in this case, we left an open door for there to be more story, or at least for this story to intersect with where the DCU is. And I think that's part of the job, is the you want to leave, when you come in and tell a story, you want to leave the possibility of other stories that can branch out from where you've been. That's part and parcel of working in a shared universe.
Okay, so while you are not allowed to say if if anything's going forward, are you allowed to say if there's been conversations of something possibly moving forward?
I can neither confirm nor deny anything. I can confirm that we had a really good time doing the book, and everybody was really happy with it.
Can you confirm if there's a potential in some manner of revisiting Kyle Rayner in the hopefully nearer future?
Well, I never say never, for my own part. I never say never, and whenever DC comes to me and says, "Hey, what do you think about doing this?" As long as my schedule allows, yeah, I'll do it, because obviously you end up feeling closer to characters that you created
Hmm.
than characters than you pick up after somebody else has brought them into the world. That's just human nature, I think. And I love writing all the characters in the Green Lantern universe. I love writing all of the DC characters, period. But I think Kyle's always going to be more personal to me because he didn't exist before Daryl and I got there.
Hmm. So what's next for you then?
Let's see. Stuff for 2025 that's not announced yet. I'm doing some more stuff for Savage Sword of Conan, which is just, that's a bucket list thing for me. Um, to be able to be in Savage Sword, doing black and white stories, that was a big magazine as a kid for me.
Is this connected to what's going on in Titan with Conan, or is this a separate entity?
No, this is with Titan. This is with Heroic Signatures, who are handling things editorially, and then it gets published through Titan. So I'm working on some Savage Sword of Conan stories for the Black and White magazine, which, like I said, is that was when I decided comics were for kids when I was 13 or 14. I kept reading Savage Sword because, well, that's a magazine. That's for adults. So to be able to, kind of come full circle and do that, I'm pretty pleased. So there are those. There's, like I said, various and sundry stories that are not announced yet. I have a story in the Pots and Panels Kickstarter that's which I didn't have time to do, but those guys twisted my arm and talked me into it. So I've got a story and a recipe in that, with Andy Kuhn drawing the art. It's a 1930s noir kind of story. And I continue working on the Diablo franchise for Blizzard video games. We just put out the first expansion, which I worked a lot on, for Diablo 4 this week, and the reviews were great, and the sales were great, and everybody seems to be enjoying it. So, I'm juggling things, as that's just the writer's lot in life, is you're usually juggling a few different projects. I never I never have a day when I get up in the morning and don't know what to do. So it keeps me occupied.
Well, Mr. Marz, whenever you're ready to talk about any project you're coming up with, especially in the DC universe with maybe a particular character like, Kyle Rayner or anything else, feel free to come back on the show. It's always been an honor to speak with you, sir, and thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jeff. It's good to see you.
Have a very good night.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Verdant Stars podcast. Please like and subscribe. Return for the next episode when Matt Rowan, Sarah Wiley, and Zen boards the mothership to discuss Mist, Address Unknown. To the next voyage, travel on.